Hello and welcome to Lecture 37 on Renaissance Italy for Ancient and Medieval Worlds. So today we're going to look at a series of cultural movements that have been grouped together as the Renaissance, which is a term that means rebirth. Now, almost any cultural flowering today is called a Renaissance. We've seen several occasions where scholars have used this term for other eras in history. Charlemagne's Carolingian Renaissance, for instance, back in the 800s, or the rise of universities in Western Europe that was called the Renaissance of the 12th century. But of course, these aren't the only other places that historians have borrowed the term Renaissance. You can look, for instance, at the 1920s Harlem Renaissance in New York City, or the Celtic Renaissance in Ireland slightly earlier. All of these appellations of Renaissance seek to capture something of the mystique of the first period of cultural revival to be called a rebirth, and that is what happened in Italy from the mid-1300s until the early 1500s, with its famous figures like the authors Boccaccio, Petrarch, and Dante, the cutthroat political families like the Borgias and the Medicis, political theorists like Niccolo Machiavelli, and the artists Michelangelo, Donatello, and Raphael of Ninja Turtles fame, as well as the overrated Leonardo da Vinci and many others. Now, this movement expanded into the rest of Europe and continued, especially in the 1500s and into the early 1600s in the so-called Northern Renaissance of the Netherlands and England, with artists like Dürer, Hieronymus Bosch, Hans Holbein, and Peter Bruegel the Elders, the writers like Erasmus, Rabelais, and of course most famously Shakespeare. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to cover all of these people. I'm just trying to give you a sense of what we're talking about. You've heard of at least some of these people. They have become cultural icons and household names. But Renaissance is also a word that has baggage. In its general usage, it implies that the period before the rebirth was worse than what came after. And history is always more complicated than that. We've seen some pretty impressive as well as horrible things in the Middle Ages. But the same is going to be true of the early modern period. That's the term now preferred by scholars over the word Renaissance to describe this era. The early modern period, from the 1500s on, saw, for instance, the peak of witch trials, as well as intra-Christian religious warfare in Europe. It was the growth of the authoritarian state. It saw the origins of the evils of Western imperialism, such as genocide in the Americas or the Atlantic slave trade. The Renaissance, therefore, was not a progress from an age of darkness into enlightenment. That's not something that's happened in any era of history. After all, the modern era has produced the Holocaust, nuclear war, totalitarianism, and other evils unimaginable to the Middle Ages. Every era of history has both its sins and its accomplishments, and we'll be looking at both for the era of Renaissance Italy in this class today. Now, anything called a Renaissance is going to be a cultural movement, meaning the arts and humanities took a noticeable uptick. That means you're going to get the names of a bunch of famous artists, like I just listed briefly, and a whole bunch of pictures and quotations. Now, this lecture will try and keep all of that to a minimum, because this isn't an art history course or a literature course. What we are interested in here is what the Renaissance means to history, how it started, how it spread, and in the second part of this video, how it ended. Well, let's discuss the term Renaissance first. It is the French for rebirth, and it didn't come into common English usage until the 1800s. The first, though, to use the term rebirth for this cultural movement in Italy was an art critic by the name of Vasari, who lived right after the Renaissance was already over, in the mid-1500s. Vasari used the Italian term for rebirth to describe an era of great artists in a book he wrote that consisted of a series of biographies of the artists he considered to be the most important of this cultural movement in Italy over the course of the past 200 or so years before he wrote it. The Renaissance as a term has therefore always been associated with artistic achievement. Only later would modern historians apply Renaissance more broadly to describe the period of time more generally, and the current consensus now shies away from this term in much the same way that feudalism as a term has become unpopular, precisely because it has become too widely applied. And you'll also notice that it's very often that a term for an era really only comes into existence after that era is already over. Part of the reason that the term Renaissance has fallen out of favor, though, is its implications. The rebirth in question is a rebirth of the glories of the classical world of Greece and Rome, and that implies a sharp break with the more immediate medieval past. Most scholars now argue that this change was gradual and emphasize continuity over sharp breaks. But the term rebirth is appropriate to describe at least one thing, and that was the attitude of the people who participated in Renaissance culture. The elite artists and intellectuals and their patrons who contributed to the movement that we now call the Renaissance. These Renaissance men, as they are now called, and there were also a few women, were self-conscious of themselves as living in a new era. One of the few occasions in history where this was really the case, at least for a small elite who had the wealth to enjoy it. How far down that extended is the subject of a great deal of historical debate. Now, the Renaissance as we think of it today, both in artistic and broader cultural terms, began in Florence, a city less than 200 miles north of Rome in Italy. Italy north of Rome throughout this period was a collection of independent city-states, sometimes beholden to the Holy Roman Emperor, but just as often resisting German authority. This part of Italy had remained far more urban than the rest of Western Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire, and maintained, as we have seen, greater commercial contacts with the rest of the world via the Mediterranean, with Venice as perhaps the most successful example, but among many, and we've talked about Venice before as a good example of this. Now, scholars debate a number of factors contributing to the Renaissance here in northern Italy. Here are some of the things that have been posited as to why the Renaissance was happening in this particular place and time. There was a concentration of resources and people in urban centers here, much more so than the rest of Europe. That led to a competition between and within city-states that encouraged artistic and architectural achievements as another form of status and pride. And you could think of this in comparable terms to the way the United States and Russia during the Cold War would compete with each other via the Olympics or their space programs. There was also greater wealth and access to other cultures provided by Italy's closer connections with global commerce. It was therefore built upon the legacy of the Crusades, because the Crusades were a big part of revitalizing Western trade connections with the rest of the world and solidified the Italians as the main Christian merchants to that trade. There were perhaps other factors, like greater access to the remains of the Roman past, as Italy had of course been the center of the Roman Empire, and there was arguably greater social mobility encouraged by urban life and the relative prioritization of commerce over landowning, as Italy was perhaps the least feudal society in Western Europe. That's a gross oversimplification. These are the sorts of things that are the subject of much historical debate, and as we've seen with several other complex cultural movements before in this class, going all the way back to the late Bronze Age collapse, it's probably really a combination of all of these factors and many more that led the Renaissance to happen in this time and in this place. Now, the transition from medieval to Renaissance began with a couple of Florentine citizens, my favorite of whom are Dante Alighieri, the poet who wrote the great Divine Comedy, which is more commonly known for its first third, the Inferno, and his contemporary, the artist Giotto di Bondone. Both of these men produced their finest works in the first couple of decades of the 1300s. Now, Dante was one of the first to write literature in Italian rather than Latin, while Giotto was credited by the critic Vasari with being the first to paint realistically from life, rather than the medieval style, which was that valued symbolic meaning over realism. And here we actually have a painting often credited to Giotto from a series of frescoes of St. Francis. And actually this painting of Dante was also done by Giotto. The two men knew each other personally. But perhaps just as important was that we know the names of these two artists. They have personality. They were considered heroes by their contemporaries for their achievements. Now, that's not to say that we don't know the names of any writers from earlier on in the Middle Ages, but I don't know of a single example of an earlier writer who has a biography written of him immediately after his death, like Dante. Dante was worshipped as a hero of literature within a decade of his death. And as I said, Giotto is credited by this later art critic Vasari. Artists were far more likely to be anonymous, especially in the visual arts during the earlier Middle Ages, while the Italian Renaissance celebrated artists as great men equal to or greater than rulers or warriors. Again, not necessarily an entirely new concept, but a question of emphasis. And we only need to look back to our first medieval reading in this class, Beowulf, which is, of course, an anonymous poem. We have no idea who wrote Beowulf. Now this leads us to another important term associated with the most famous Renaissance, and that is humanism. Now humanism here should not be confused with the modern term secular humanism used by some atheists to describe themselves. Renaissance humanism was never seen by its adherents as being in opposition to their faith as Christians, and an enormous amount of Renaissance art has Christian themes or subjects, like Dante's epic Divine Comedy, which is a journey through the Christian afterlife, or Giotto's famous frescoes of St. Francis of Assisi. Scholars do not agree on an exact definition of humanism, in part because it was not an organized philosophical school or overarching set of principles like the earlier Greek philosophical schools. Humanism was more of a way of life and a lived experience committed to the classics of Greco-Roman antiquity, which humanists read voraciously and then attempted to imitate and enact in their own lives, which classics exactly varied over time, as we shall see. There was very little access to the Greek classics in the time of Dante and Giotto. These became more popular later on. It also varied from place to place. The man most often associated with the birth of humanism was another Italian associated with Florence named Petrarch, who lived about a generation after Dante and Giotto. Now, Petrarch is famous amongst medievalists for coming up with the term the Dark Ages, and in so doing inventing the idea that the Middle Ages was a period separating himself from the classical antiquity that he loved, from what he saw as the high point of civilization with Greece and Rome. And so Petrarch, in naming these Dark Ages, clearly meant this negatively. He saw recapturing the glory of the Greco-Roman classics as being absolutely essential in order to escape the Dark Ages, which he saw as barbaric. You can't have a Renaissance unless something has been lost. There can't be a rebirth unless there was an initial birth and then it was lost and now we need a rebirth. Now, confusingly, Renaissance literature, despite this love of the Greco-Roman classics, is strongly associated with writing in the vernacular, that is, not in Latin. Dante is seen as one of the first great poets of the Italian language, for instance, although he was fluent in Latin as well. This is also not a sharp break with the medieval past. For instance, for the previous 2 centuries before Dante, there was a great movement of French literature at the time. Now, Dante is therefore seen as one of the first great poets of the Italian language, but it's worth pointing out he was also fluent in Latin as well, as would any humanist be in this time period, because that was necessary to read the Latin classics. And this is related to another quality of humanism that you'll often hear, where humanism is described as the invention of the individual, that is, with an emphasis on human freedom. This, then, is characterized by a turn towards naturalism in both the visual arts, like what Giotto began in painting, and in literature with the use of the vernacular everyday speech rather than the learned and formal Latin, as with Dante's poetry. But as with everything else involved with the idea of the Renaissance, this was really an evolution of the medieval world rather than a sharp break from it. It's not like people in the Middle Ages didn't know they were individuals or care about being free. It's a question of emphasis. Humanists in the Renaissance celebrated the individual as they did when they praised and glorified artists. In this respect, Vasari's biographies of famous Renaissance artists are an excellent example of this aspect of humanism that focuses on the individual. Think about this in contrast with the most popular form of biography of the Middle Ages, which was hagiography, the lives of saints. But all of these saints were supposed to imitate and be like Christ, not necessarily like themselves. But at its core, humanism is about the classical world of Greek and Rome. Even here, though, there's no firm break with the medieval tradition. It was, after all, medieval monks who preserved classical literature. And as we saw, medieval universities were obsessed with the Aristotelian classical text. Again, it's really a question of emphasis. For medieval thinkers, who were primarily in the clergy, as I mentioned when we discussed university culture, the Latin classics from the era of pagan Rome, great Latin writers like Cicero or Seneca, were read to improve grammar and rhetorical skill, or for logical methods, not for their own sake. They were preparation for the more valued study of Christian theology. For Renaissance humanists, the classics were read for their own cultural value. Again, this was not a return to paganism or a rejection of Christianity. It was instead a question of emphasis. Priests and members of the clergy could be humanists, but there was now a shift towards members of the laity, the non-clergy, receiving an education. Most of the famous Renaissance men were not clerics, unlike the great thinkers of the European Middle Ages. Now, humanists, in keeping with Petrarch's notion of a dark age, did have a certain disdain for the medieval past, and we can see a pretty ubiquitous modern example, and in terminology, humanists really hated the medieval past and thought of it as barbaric, but rather than simply call it barbaric, they referred to it by the most famous form of barbarians, those nasty Goths, whom they saw as the ones who had brought down the Roman Empire. And so everything medieval that was, or at least the kind of medieval that they saw around them, high medieval art and culture, was referred to by the humanists as Gothic. Gothic cathedrals, the Gothic font. These are not actually terms from the Middle Ages. No one building a Gothic cathedral ever referred to it as a Gothic cathedral. That was a humanist term that was meant to denigrate that style of art as being barbaric, as being like the Goths. We can see this in another example, though, in the Gothic font, which is the middle of the three fonts that I have here. It's a very highly stylized, very difficult to read form of script that was quite popular throughout medieval Western Europe at the time that the Renaissance was beginning. Humanists wanted to look back for the oldest possible manuscripts that contained classical Latin texts that they could get their hands on. And when they found these texts, that were by this point hundreds of years old, they saw that they were in a much more legible and clear script than the high and late medieval handwriting of the Gothic style, which the humanists derided. And so they assumed that these books that they had found, these ancient books they had found, were Roman. And they emulated the style of letters that they found there, calling them Roman. But in fact, these were not Roman letters, and if you go back to our earlier lecture on the Carolingians, you will see that this was Carolingian letter writing. These were Caroline minuscule, as it's often called. This is around the time when lowercase letters became prevalent alongside uppercase letters. No humanist, however, could admit such a thing of the supposedly barbarous Carolingians, so they insisted that this was the Roman font. And that's actually why that ubiquitous font you find on all computers today, Times New Roman, is called what it is. Even though it's not based on the Roman font, it is in fact based on the Carolingian font. So we can thank humanists for naming most prominent styles of art in the High Middle Ages Gothic, Gothic cathedrals, Gothic font, and so on, to describe medieval art that they saw as barbaric, and after the most famous of all classical barbarians, the Goths. And of course, as humanists, they always preferred the most classical possible example in everything, even including their barbarians. Humanists actively sought out lost Latin manuscripts, sitting neglected in monastic and cathedral libraries. Every rediscovered work was a gift for these classics-obsessed humanists, but it took an outside development to reconnect them with the Greek part of the Greco-Roman tradition. Now, knowledge of Greek had been almost entirely lost in Western Europe by the Carolingian age some 600 years earlier. Dante, for instance, never read anything by Homer, no Iliad, no Odyssey. Instead, when he wrote his Divine Comedy, starting with the Inferno, he emulated the Latin epic of Virgil, who wrote in the time of Augustus, which was modeled on Homer's epics, but Dante is only getting Homer through the lens of Virgil. And in fact, Virgil becomes a character in the Divine Comedy because of this. Very few of the Greek classics had been translated into Latin, because any Roman who wanted to read them just learned Greek. Most Romans were bilingual. Now, we've talked about this problem before with universities. The scholastics, who were obsessed with Aristotle, had been obsessed with Greek knowledge, but where did they get it from? They got it via Arabic translations that were then translated into Latin in Spain and Sicily, as we've already seen. Thomas Aquinas did not learn Greek or have access to the Greek originals of the Aristotelian works that he modeled his own theology on. The Arabs and other Muslim intellectuals were only interested in certain kinds of Greek writing, mostly philosophy and science, which they would have thought of as much more connected than we do. Science, as we use it, became a popular term only in the 1800s. Before that, the study of nature was simply called natural philosophy. Muslims were far less interested in Greek literature and historical writing, where they tended to prefer Persian pre-Muslim traditions. But the Renaissance's origins came just as the Byzantine Empire was in its last gasp, as we saw last time, under pressure from the Ottomans. And thousands of Greek speakers fled the Byzantine Empire during the course of the 1400s, even before the fall of Constantinople, and most of them arrived in Italy. Now, while most Greeks preferred to keep their own Orthodox religion, and therefore preferred, as we saw in our last lecture, the turban of the Sultan to the crown of the Pope, as the saying went, choosing to become dhimmi under Ottoman rule, a minority chose to flee to Western Europe. Most of these voluntary exiles settled in nearby Italy. That was the closest spot within Western Europe to settle in, and they brought their books and knowledge of Greek with them, and they shared these with Renaissance humanists, who devoured this whole new world of knowledge eagerly. For instance, the Greek bishop Vasari fled to Rome even before the fall of Constantinople. He clearly saw the end coming, and he was made a cardinal by the Pope at the time. And as cardinal, he had access to resources, he had landed wealth, and he patronized both Greek exiles and Italian humanists. Vasari even donated his library to the city of Venice in 1468, which still, to this day, forms the core of Venice's public library.